Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Keith Lima. This is Raw Vegan Science. Today's episode, we're going to be discussing how to eat seasonally, the history of raw fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds. So as I start this video, I'm going to go through some basic definitions. Everyone knows what cortisol is, right? Cortisol is the stress hormone. In particular, cortisol is a hormone which is produced in your adrenal gland that increases the amount of glucose in your blood. Did you know that? Did you know cortisol increases the amount of glucose in your blood? Spikes your blood sugar. It also regulates your sleep-wake cycle, and it suppresses inflammation. Cortisol is so important to the body, it has an effect on almost every tissue in the human body. The next hormone is melatonin. Melatonin is a hormone which is produced in response to darkness, and it indirectly inhibits the release of cortisol. So if your body is producing melatonin, it is also dialing down on the production of cortisol. Cortisol and melatonin have an inverse relationship. Next is glucagon. In the dietary space, we hear a lot about glucose, we hear a lot about insulin. You don't often hear about glucagon. Glucagon is another hormone that has an inverse relationship with insulin. Glucagon increases the amount of glucose in the blood, and it releases fat from fat cells. In essence, glucagon causes your body to burn energy. Now, insulin, of course, everybody knows what insulin is. It's a hormone produced in the pancreas, which decreases the amount of glucose in the blood. It also inhibits glucagon release. So just like up here, where there's an inverse relationship between melatonin and cortisol, there's an inverse relationship between insulin and glucagon. The more insulin there is in the blood, the less glucagon there's going to be in your bloodstream. Now, all of these four factors here, it's important to notice that while melatonin is controlling cortisol and while insulin is controlling glucagon, light, any type of light, artificial light, sunlight, what have you, light has indirect control over all four of these. In fact, you could say light is the master controller of all four. Light is the master controller of cortisol, melatonin, glucagon, and insulin. Why is all of this important? Well, it comes down to something called cycles. So a cycle, of course, is a series of events that are regularly repeated in the same order. So if we look over here, there are two types of cycles in particular that affect the human body and affect our physiology. They're daily cycles and they're seasonal cycles. So if all of these hormones are being controlled by light and all of them are linked to a cycle, then what's controlling them? Well, in a daily cycle, of course, you have daylight during the day and then you have darkness at night. So what's going on during the day? During the day, with light, you have light controlling all four of these. So light during the day is going to decrease the amount of melatonin in your blood, and indirectly it's going to increase your cortisol. That's throughout the day. What else is happening throughout the day? Well, if you're not a night shifter and you're up during the day, you're also eating during the day. And if you're eating, you're producing insulin. So the light decreases the melatonin, which increases the cortisol, which regulates your sleep-wake cycle. Then you're eating and you're producing insulin. So you're storing energy during the day, and at night when glucagon is elevated, you're burning energy. So this is your daily cycle, but what about a seasonal cycle? So in a seasonal cycle, seasonal cycles are also controlled with daylight. So in a seasonal cycle, if you take a look, and obviously this chart is not exact, this is just an example, but if you take a look at the hours of daylight in a temperate climate, you have the least amount of daylight hours in the winter and autumn and the most in the spring and summer. And this is all connected with light. So why is all of this important? Well, a couple of years ago, I read a book called Lights Out. Lights Out, Sleep, Sugar, and Survival. Get 9+ hours of sleep a night and lose weight, curb your cravings for carbohydrates, eradicate depression, lower your blood pressure, etc., etc. So to dive into further detail, let's go to part 2 of this video. This is Earth. It's also proof that I got a C in my college art class. But this represents Earth. This is 40 degrees north and 33 degrees south. This is the equator. Now, there are primates in 90 countries across the Neotropics, Africa, and Asia. So primates like humans. There are approximately 439 species of primates, and 286 of them, fully 2/3, live in only 4 countries: Brazil, Madagascar, Indonesia, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There are exceptions, of course, and there are always exceptions to every rule. One exception is the Japanese macaque, which is called the snow monkey. It has dense layers of fur that allows it to survive temperatures as low as 7 degrees Fahrenheit or 14 below Celsius. This is an exception, but even exceptions, the Japanese macaque prefers Japan's subtropics. But the whole point to this is humans did not evolve in temperate climates. Humans are from the tropics. So in a temperate climate, you have 4 seasons: spring, summer, fall, winter, etc. But in a tropical environment, you don't have 4 seasons, you have 2. There's a wet season and a dry season. So just like in part number 1, where we talked about daily cycles and seasonal cycles, the same still applies in a tropical environment, but it's a little different. So now if we look at the graph of daylight hours in a tropical climate and what that seasonal cycle looks like, you still get a curve. You get a wet season in the middle, which would represent summer, the tropical analog for summer, and then you get the dry season. And here's the number of daylight hours. Notice that there's less of a spike. In a temperate climate, you would get a large spike. In fact, the closer and closer you get to the North Pole or the South Pole, the more daylight you have during the summer and the less you have during the winter, of course. You go to Alaska, northern Alaska, and summertime it's daylight 24 hours a day. But in the tropics, it's a little bit more flat. So how does this affect food availability? Well, if our species comes from the tropics and we rewind the clock 3 or 4 million years, then the availability of fruit is also linked to the hours of daylight. There are exceptions, of course, to every rule, but for the most part, even in the tropics, the most fruit is available during the wet season, which correlates to hours of daylight. So the more daylight, the more fruit that's available. So how does this get tied in with carbs, and why is all of this important? Well, I just showed you a book that I read a few years ago called Lights Out, and I want to show you another one. This book is called The 4-Season Solution: The Groundbreaking New Plan for Feeling Better, Living Well, and Powering Down Our Always-On Lives. It's written by a man named Dallas Hartwick. And I believe he was the author of The Whole 30. Dallas Hartwick is not a vegan. He's not a raw vegan, not a vegan. But when I read this book, I found it interesting because a lot of modern diets only take into account what you're eating. They don't take into account other things like seasonal cycles. Dallas Hartwick goes into deep detail about seasonal cycles and how they should affect our diet. In the summertime, you have a larger availability of, a much higher availability of fruit. And in the wintertime, it looks different. There's no, at least in temperate climates, there's no fruit available in temperate climates. And in the tropics, there are ever-bearing fruit trees in the tropics, but again, they are the exception. For the most part, in the tropics, you're going to see a jump in fruit availability in the wet season, again, the tropical analog for summer, and then that's going to decline in the winter. So how does that look in terms of food availability? Well, we're going to jump to part 3, and I'm going to show you how that affected our food availability throughout our history. Okay, so if we look at a chart of tropical food availability of food in the tropics, we have a breakdown here. Fruits, green leafy vegetables, nuts, and seeds. And then we have 2 seasons, again, because it's the tropics. We have the wet season and we have the dry season. Now, again, there are exceptions to this, but the general rule, in the tropics, fruits are more available in the wet season than they are in the dry. Green leafy vegetables are available wet season and the dry season. Nuts are available in the wet season and the dry season, and seeds are typically only available in the wet season, or at least towards the end of the wet season. So again, there are exceptions to this. There are some fruits that are ever-bearing. They're available year-round. Bananas, coconuts, papaya, pineapple, noni, stuff like that. There are fruits that are available year-round, but in general, this is what you see in the tropics, the rainforest, etc. Wet season, you're going to see an availability of fruits and seeds, and in the dry season, green leafy vegetables and nuts. Why is this important? It's important because fruits tend to be high in carbohydrates. Again, not all. Avocados tend to be very high in fat, but in general, fruits are high in carbohydrates. Nuts tend to be high in fat, not so much carbs. Again, there are exceptions, but the general rule, fruits come with carbs and nuts come with fat. Again, why is that important? Because carbohydrates are going to stimulate your insulin. It's going to stimulate your insulin, and you're going to store those carbohydrates. You're going to store the fat. Your body is in storage mode to prepare for the dry season or famine, what have you. We live in a society today where it's all wet season. It's all summertime, all year round. Winter never comes. But our bodies adapted to a system whereby in the summer or wet season, we stored energy, and then in the winter or dry season, we burned it. Our bodies have a daytime physiology and a nighttime physiology. And they also have a summertime or wet season physiology and a wintertime and dry season physiology. One of the reasons why we're having so much illness in modern society, and especially for the last 10,000 years, is because it's been summer for the past 10,000 years. Year round, we eat fruits, rice. We're loaded with carbs all summer long and all winter long. It wasn't always that way. So then if you look at this chart again, what would have happened, let's say 5 million years ago, if we were living in the tropics and it were the dry season, or if it were wintertime? We would not have any access to fruits. With a few exceptions, we wouldn't have access to fruits. Therefore, we would not have access to those carbohydrates. We would not have access to seeds. Therefore, we would not have access to carbohydrates. What are we left with? We're left with green leafy vegetables, and we're left with nuts. Why nuts? Because nuts come in a shell. They're not going to rot or go bad like fruits are. But again, in the wild, fruits wouldn't go bad anyway. All the animals would eat them. But you have an availability of green leafy vegetables and nuts in the dry season and in the wintertime. And to explain how all of this ties together, we're going to go to part 4. Okay, so in order to explain where I'm going with all this, I want to draw a picture. I want to paint a picture of what is happening in your body under 3 different circumstances. The first is what happens to your body at night, what happens to your body in the winter, and what happens to your body during the day or in the summer. So we're going to start out with light. Now that could be sunlight, it could be artificial light, it doesn't matter. It could be the light on your cell phone if you're watching this video at 2 o'clock in the morning. Light is light. So let's start out with light and let's look at a daily cycle. It's nighttime, the sun's down, you've got your cell phone turned off, you got the lights off. Your body starts producing melatonin. There's this thing called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and that responds to darkness. In turn, your body produces melatonin. The melatonin starts putting you to sleep. As you sleep, your insulin drops. And your insulin drops because you're not eating. As your insulin drops, your glucagon increases. As your glucagon increases, your body starts to then burn glucose and burn fat. Keep in mind, I'm not saying that the glucagon itself is causing glucose to come out of your blood. What I'm saying is the glucagon, there's this thing called glycogen. And glycogen is basically a bunch of glucose molecules that are linked into a chain, okay? Insulin causes your body to put that chain together and store glucose, while glucagon causes your body to break that chain apart and release the glucose into your bloodstream, okay? So insulin is storing it, glucagon is releasing it. So it's nighttime, you're producing melatonin, you fall asleep, you're not eating, so your insulin decreases, your glucagon goes up, and you start burning energy. You start burning glucose, burning fat. And you thought you needed to exercise to burn energy. You do, but you also burn energy while you're sleeping because of this effect. Okay? Also, melatonin decreases the release of cortisol, or it inhibits the release of cortisol. And as cortisol is decreased, so does your stress response decrease. So as you can see, you go to sleep at night and there's this whole physiology that's going on in your body at night that does not happen during the day, or at least that doesn't happen when you're exposed to light. If it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you're still watching your cell phone, you still have the lights on, this hasn't kicked in. Or maybe it's trying, maybe you're trying to fall asleep, but you're not producing anywhere near the kind of melatonin that you would if you just turned the phone off, you turned the lights off, and went to bed in a dark room. That's the daily cycle of what happens when the lights are off. What about seasonally? Okay, seasonally, you have less light in the winter, and you have less light in the dry season in the tropics. And again, it's less extreme in the tropics, but you still have less light in the wintertime / dry season. So what happens? Well, there's less carbohydrates that are available. The fruit is gone, the seeds are pretty much gone, you have nuts, and you have green leafy vegetables. So what happens in an environment where your carbohydrate availability is decreased? Your insulin drops, your glucagon increases, and you burn glucose and you burn fat. Not only do you have an entire physiology for the nighttime, you have an entire physiology for wintertime, dry season, and famine. So, this is all in contrast to what happens when the lights are on. So what about during the day? Actually, seasonally, what happens when there's more light available in the summertime and in the wet season? Carbohydrate availability goes up. There are now fruits, there are seeds, carbohydrates everywhere. Your insulin increases in a process to store all of that glucose. So your insulin goes up, glucose storage goes up. Insulin has an inhibitory effect on fat release. So actually this, I should also do this. Insulin also inhibits fat release. And all of this put together means that you are now storing glucose and you are storing fat. Notice that one is get up and go, and another is store and go to sleep. So you have two systems for your physiology. You have a physiology during the day, physiology at night, and then you have a physiology during the summer and a physiology during the winter. So how does all of this fit together with a raw vegan diet and all of the diets that we have going on out there? Why is all of this important? It's important because we live in a society now where there are a lot of different diets going around. There's keto, there's vegan, etc., etc. The problem with getting locked into a particular diet is diets lock you into one of these physiologies. The assumption is, oh, okay, well, you should eat just carbohydrates and not worry about the fat, and it should just be carbohydrates. Well, the problem with that is you're locked into a daytime/summertime physiology, and you're completely ignoring your nighttime physiology/winter physiology. On the other hand, you have diets like keto. Keto is all about fat and cutting your carbohydrates. The problem is it locks you into a wintertime physiology or nighttime physiology. The truth is your body goes back and forth, or should go back and forth, between both physiologies. Daytime, nighttime, summer, winter, wet season, dry season. All right, so where does that leave us? Well, in conclusion, if it's summertime, you're a raw vegan, if it's summertime, go ahead and eat fruits, seeds, maybe decrease in leafy vegetables. If it's wintertime, go ahead and eat vegetables, nuts, and definitely an increase in green leafy vegetables. I am not saying that you shouldn't eat vegetables in the winter and you shouldn't eat, that you shouldn't eat fruits in the winter and you shouldn't eat vegetables in the summer. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is it might not be a bad idea to eat more fruits and seeds and less green leafy vegetables in the summer, and more green leafy vegetables in the winter, more nuts and vegetables in the winter. You can kind of see the cycle back and forth. That brings me to two big topics, especially in the raw vegan space, and that is juicing and oil. Okay. Technically speaking, juice and oil are processed foods, okay? If you're going to eat a whole food plant-based diet, which is an excellent diet to eat, you're probably in the green. You're probably safe. A lot of raw foodists recommend juicing and shy away from oil. This is an interesting contradiction because either juicing is okay and eating oil is okay, or eating oil is not okay and juicing is not okay. But there is a third option. Maybe one is okay at a certain time of year and the other one is okay at another time of year. You tell me, what's your opinion? Before I end this episode, this book, The 4-Season Solution, again, the author is not he's not a raw vegan. He's not even a vegan. But it is an interesting paradigm shift. So many diets today get you locked into a particular physiology. And if you get nothing else from this video today, understand that you do not have one physiology. You have two physiologies. And diets get you locked into one at the exclusion of the other. It should be both. Dallas Hartwig in this book really brings up the idea of leaning into one physiology in the winter seasons and then leaning into your summer physiology in the summertime. So interesting thoughts. Tell me what you think. Leave your comments below. For more content that'll help you thrive in a world of crazy diets and out of control physical trainers, check out the rest of my channel and please subscribe.